What's going on, everyone? This is your friendly neighborhood reptile here, back again with yet another video. And for today, we are going to be doing yet another console review on the channel. And I'm going to be revisiting some of the consoles that I've talked about before, but this time I'm going to do it in a more sophisticated style. This time, we're going to be talking about the almighty and lovely Sega Saturn. Now, this console was released in 1994 in Japan and was also released in America in 1995. Now, I did previously make a video where I discussed the history of the Sega Saturn, and not only that, but I also did the PlayStation as well, where I was comparing the graphics and all that. So if you guys are interested in checking out that video, I would highly recommend it because it's it's a very in-depth video on the tech specs of each system. Now, like I said before, there will be a follow-up video to that video where we're going to talk about which games which console had the better games. But for today, we're just going to focus on the console itself. So with that being said, we're going to begin. So first step, looking at the Sega Saturn, you can clearly see that it's a very, very big console. It's pretty hefty. Like, it's one of those heavy consoles. It does have a built-in power supply, which I think is really awesome because it kind of eliminates the use of having to use big boxes and stuff like that for your plugs and all that stuff, kind of similar to how the Sega Genesis did it. So that's very convenient. So you can clearly see at the top of the console that you have a cartridge slot, which is primarily used as a RAM cart because you can actually insert cartridges in there. Most notably, you could insert this little guy right here, which is what is known as the Action Replay 4M Plus RAM cart. And what this thing does is that it allows you to play not only import games on your Sega Saturn, but it also has a bunch of game codes loaded on it. And you can also use it as a memory card, and it also is an expansion RAM too. So it allows you to play some of the games that are already for the Saturn in a much more stable performance, almost kind of similar to the expansion pack on the Nintendo 64, which I think is really cool. So that's one thing I love about the Saturn. But let's continue. So that's one thing that I do like about the Saturn. The only thing that I think was a missed opportunity is that they could have had the cartridge slot of the Sega Saturn essentially have backwards compatibility, but it never happened. But I feel like if they did that, it probably would have been more interesting. But besides that, I'm still satisfied with what we got. You can see that it has two controller ports in it. Now, similar to the Sony PlayStation, you had to use a multi-tap accessory, essentially to play 4 players. Which again, it was kind of a drag too, because it was there were other consoles that existed, especially before this system existed, that did 4 players. Most infamously, the Atari 5200, but not. Everybody didn't really care about that system anyway. But I'm just pointing it out. You know what I mean? But on the other hand, the Nintendo 64 came out in 1996, which was a year after the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation came out in America. And that console had all 4 controller ports, eliminating the use of any multi-tap accessories. So it is a bit of a con, not too much, but it is what it is. So as you can see also, when we turn to the back, we can see this little battery slot right here. Now, what this battery slot does is that it has a little backup battery in there, like for your data, like the clock and the date and all that stuff. And it also acts as an additional memory, actually as primary storage. It doesn't have too much room on it, but if you don't have the Action Replay cart, the backup battery is a decent alternative. But the only thing is that if the battery dies off, you will lose your saved data, so be very, very careful. Most of these backup batteries, you can easily buy them off of Amazon and all that stuff for like 5 packs for only $3. I mean, that's how much I got, and they all last for years. Most backup batteries like this, at least one singular battery, usually lasts for a year. You can also see this is where your communicator cable is. Now, I can't exactly remember what this is for, but if memory serves me correctly, this is where you would link one Sega Saturn console with another, because you know that's how a lot of consoles were back then. Like if you wanted to play with a buddy, like have a local game or something like that that isn't like involving two controllers in the same console, you would essentially link the system up to another system, and I believe that's what this port is for. And right here you have your, obviously, your AV output right here. Now if you're a guy like me who wants to kind of play these games in like HD clarity, one thing that you can do is that you can go out of your way to hunt down this cable right here, which is known as the Extreme Plug and Play HDMI for the Sega Saturn. And what this does is that this $30 HDMI cable allows you to upscale your Sega Saturn up to 720p quality, and it also has the ability to either go from 4:3 or to 16:9. So whether or not if you prefer you know, standard screen or widescreen or whatnot, you know, that depends on you. But it does give you the option to switch between the two different ratios, which I think is really cool. And for a $30 cable, it actually really does do the good job. It makes the pictures come in very clear, nice and vibrant, and it's just an amazing cable, and it's very affordable. Like I said, you know, a great cheap alternative to what's out there. So the first one we got right here is the Sega Saturn Model 1 controller. This is the one that comes with the model of the Sega Saturn that I have. So right here, this is the Sega Saturn Model 1 controller. You can clearly see that it's a pretty big, you know, it's a pretty big controller. You know, I mean, it's not very fat and all that stuff, but I mean, when you put it in your hands, it actually does kind of feel comfortable, especially with the way the back of the controller is built. Like it's kind of got these beefy like hand ends right there, to the point where like if you put it in your hands, it just fits perfectly right into your hands. You know what I'm saying? And it also has a pretty cool looking D-pad that responds very, very well, and it's a 6-button controller, obviously basing it off of the Genesis 6-button controller for the Sega Genesis. And it also has triggers on it as well that when you hit them, it sounds like a mouse click. Hear this. Yeah, that's pretty. That's a pretty unique sound, right? So yeah, the Model 1 controller is a pretty good controller, and it works very well. But there's also another controller that exists for the Sega Saturn that's actually based off of the Japanese controller, and that is the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller. The biggest difference between the Model 1 and the Model 2 controller is that the Model 1 controller never existed in Japan and was made specifically for the one in America, while the Model 2 controller is based off of the controller from Japan. The only difference is that it's in black. So this one right here has a different D-pad. It still feels pretty good. I'll even go as far as say it probably feels slightly better than the Model 1 Sega Saturn controller, in my opinion, because it just kind of gives you a little bit more freedom, if anything, like, if that makes sense. Like, that's just what I feel. And it's also got a little start button right in the middle, and you also have your obvious X, Y, Z, and A, B buttons as well, which I think is really cool. And it also has the trigger buttons, which still sounds like mouse clicks when you touch them. But other than that, it's still a pretty cool controller. Now, in my opinion, both of the Sega Saturn controllers are both really, really good controllers in their own right. I would highly suggest getting both of them because these controllers are just really awesome, and I freaking love them. One of the many best Saturn games you should get are Grandia, which is the Japanese version. Obviously, it was only released in Japan, unless you were playing it on PlayStation, then that's a different story. But yeah, Grandia, and then you also have Guardian Heroes, Bug, Nights in the Dreams, Darius Gaiden, Galactic Attack. You know, games like those, which are super expensive, are some of the best titles on the Sega Saturn. And I would definitely go for them. Now, some of the best titles that I do have right now in my collection, if you wish to see them, would definitely go to games like this. Virtua Fighter Remix. This is a really, really, really cool game. Now, in my opinion, I don't think it's as good as Virtua Fighter 2, but for a first-time game, it's actually not bad. Now, the thing is that this is the remix version, so it's not the original, like, original Virtua Fighter. that was released first made for the Sega Saturn. That's because that one had very crappy graphics, poor performance, and glitches and stuff like that, and that's why they made the remix as a way of making up for that horrible port. And I feel like that's a port worth checking out, particularly the remix. Now, the original Virtua Fighter on Sega Saturn is only for the most hardcore enthusiasts. Now, on the other hand, one of the biggest things about the Sega Saturn was its ability to play awesome 2D games. One in particular that I think is very underrated, but I think is pretty fun, is this one right here, Gex. Now, Gex is a platforming game made by one of the best developers ever, Crystal Dynamics, who you probably best know for developing Tomb Raider, which is awesome. But Gex is one of those platforming games where it's like it's really difficult, but at the same time it's really fun, especially if you enjoy the voice commentary, or rather the voice performance of Dana Gold, who was an HBO comedian at the time. And this game was also released on the Panasonic 3DO as well, and Gex was widely regarded as one of the best games on that console. Now, some people kind of abuse the other ports of the game, particularly like versions like this, where they feel like it doesn't play as well as the 3DO. But in my personal opinion, it plays just fine on the Sega Saturn. It runs at 60 frames per second. It's nice and colorful. The controls are nice and fluent. It's a pretty good port in my opinion. Now, would I call this one of the all-time best platformers? Not necessarily, but for a Sega Saturn game that has some of the best platformers on here, like Clockwork Knight, for example, Gex easily fits into that category as being a pretty good Sega Saturn game. And in my opinion, even if you may not, like this game all that much, I would still say that at the very least, it would be worth a weekend rental, especially at the time when the game was released. Now, here's one of the more legendary Sega Saturn games, Virtua Fighter 2. I really do love Virtua Fighter 2. I really do. Virtua Fighter 2 is a very challenging game, but it's still one of the best games on the console in my opinion, because the graphics are amazing. It's nice and colorful. The character models look absolutely amazing. I'll even go as far to say that this game graphically looks better than the Tekken trilogy on PlayStation, which is saying a lot. It's a huge opinion, but then again, you also got to keep in mind that Virtua Fighter came first as far as being a 3D fighter, so Tekken kind of fed off the success of Virtua Fighter in a way, but still stood on its own. And Virtua Fighter 2, on the other hand, is one of the many Sega Saturn games where they were able to import an arcade fighting game and basically do it damn near perfectly on the console. So that's why I'm most surprised by the results that Virtua Fighter 2 has, because it actually does kind of replicate the arcade version. So this is a must-have for your collection. Virtua Fighter 2 is one of the greatest of all time. So Virtua Fighter 2 is a must-have for your Sega Saturn. Another game that is definitely a must-have for your Sega Saturn, that's actually going to have its own review on the channel, whether or not it's going to be posted before or after this review, depends, would be this one right here. Fighting Vipers. Fighting Vipers, it uses the same exact engine as Virtua Fighter 2, but the fighting system is a lot more exaggerated than the others. Like it's got like this very unique fighting system and combo system where you can kind of launch your opponents and do like all kinds of crazy combos and stuff like that. The game kind of promotes it as realism, but it really isn't realistic at all. It just feels like a more exaggerated version of Virtua Fighter, but that's in a good way, though. And it's really fun. Like, in my opinion, Fighting Vipers is definitely one of the best games on the Sega Saturn. Like, it's amazing. It easily replicates the arcade. Much like Virtua Fighter 2, it runs at 60 frames per second. The graphics are high res. The colors are nice and vibrant and all that. Like, it's not only is it a beautiful looking game, but the gameplay is also really good too, and it utilizes the same control scheme as Virtua Fighter. So there is going to be a review of this, so make sure you guys watch my review of Fighting Vipers, because I go a lot more in depth onto it. It's not a long review, but it basically like covers the game enough, like to just give you a good insight on how the game is. and it's really, really good. Now, if you guys are also interested in seeing some of the other games in my collection that I really don't have much to say about, I can just show them to you real quick. One I got right here is Battle Arena Toshiden Remix, which the original Battle Arena Toshiden was a launch title for the Sony PlayStation, but there's also a Sega Saturn port, but there's a remix version, like the graphics are more high res. But it's a game that's only for hardcore fans because this game is really not that good. But like if you're a hardcore enthusiast, then it's worth a try, but only if you're very serious about your collection. Now, another game that I also have for my collection is Sylvia Strike, which Sylvia Strike is a game that is not only a PC game and also from the same series as well. Like, if you guys know Desert Strike on Genesis, that's what this game is actually a part of the series of. This game is also available on the PlayStation, and in my opinion, the PlayStation version is better because the frame rate is a lot smoother, whereas in the Sega Saturn port it's kind of laggy. I mean, it's still playable, but the frame rate drops kind of a lot. But again, if you really do enjoy these kind of games, then yes, I would enjoy it. Because in my opinion, Soviet Strike is really fun. I mean, there's nothing more fun than flying a helicopter and just destroying enemy bases. Like, it's really fun. Now, I also love compilation titles. I love having these in my collection, so that's why I tend to get a lot of these. And this one right here is Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Atari Collection 1. This was actually the first of many of Midway compilation titles that existed at back then. I know this one was also available on the PlayStation 1 as well, but like I said, it's part of a different series. And there's one PlayStation 1 game in particular that I've actually shown on my channel a while back, if you guys aren't aware, and that is Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Midway Collection 2, which is the sequel to this game. And in my opinion, these games it actually does emulate these old arcade games pretty well, especially for the Sega Saturn. Like, in my opinion, it does emulate these arcade games very well, like Asteroids, Battle Zone, Centipede, Missile Command, Super Breakout, Tempest, and all that stuff. Like, it's really good. Like, I obviously enjoy it. And here's my last one. I also do have Daytona USA, but it's not in the case, and I do plan to get another copy because it's not working, so I do apologize about that inconvenience. But here's the last one that I want to show from my collection, and that is Mechwarrior 2. 31st Century Combat. Now, much like Sylvia Strike, this one is also based off the PC port, the PC game of the same name. I do also own the PlayStation version of this game, and in my opinion, I think the PlayStation version plays slightly better, but it's still not the definitive way of playing Mechwarrior. The definitive way obviously has to go to the PC version, but at the same time, in my opinion, the Sega Saturn version, even though some people do kind of criticize it a little too harsh, it actually doesn't play all that bad, to be honest with you. It just takes time getting used to, especially with the Sega Saturn controller. But other than that, once you do get used to it, it's actually not bad. Like, you'll actually get loads of fun out of it, especially if you enjoy controlling robots and destroying other robots. I mean, like, there's nothing more fun than destroying robots, am I right? So anyway, with that being said, that pretty much concludes this Sega Saturn review. I mean, sorry if it's going on for way longer than intended. There was just quite a lot to say. Now, I know for a fact that when I review the PlayStation 1, there's going to be a whole lot to say. I will warn you of that right now. Now, in my opinion, the Sega Saturn is a console that I highly recommend because it really is an awesome piece of equipment right here. So, it doesn't matter which model you get because both functionally, the Model 1 and the Model 2 are both the same thing. So, it doesn't really matter which model you get. The only thing that matters is that you go down and you buy yourself a Sega Saturn because the Sega Saturn is an amazing console. At the time, even though it wasn't as successful, I do appreciate what the console was trying to do. Even though it wasn't as successful as the PlayStation 1, it was still trying to be a legit alternative, and it did. It really is a great alternative to the PlayStation 1, in my opinion. So, like, if you do have a PlayStation 1 lying around, but you want something different, even in 2020, you can obviously go down and hunt down either a Nintendo 64 or a Sega Saturn. And in my opinion, I think you should hunt down a Sega Saturn because the Sega Saturn does deserve more love than it gets. Because, like, some people still kind of throw shade at it for being a failure and all that stuff. And Sega did make some very poor decisions when they did this. But in my opinion, the Sega Saturn is a very underrated console that should be appreciated in its own right. So with that being said, that's the end of this review. And I really do hope you guys enjoyed my in-depth look of the Sega Saturn. If you guys did enjoy this review, make sure you guys hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in the next video. This is your friendly neighborhood reptile signing off.